Without conflict, you have no story. Conflict is what puts us on the edge of our seat. It's what gives a story its momentum and emotional impact. But weak, unbelievable, or melodramatic conflict ruins your entire story. So today I'm revealing the 3 keys to strong conflict and walking through real examples of bad and good conflict so you can spot weak conflict in your own story and fix it fast. Let's get started. Good conflict needs 3 key qualities to actually hit your reader emotionally. If your conflict is lacking any of these points, you need to go back to the drawing board. First, good conflict is both external and internal. If your plot only focuses on your protagonist facing external obstacles, like going into battle or outrunning a serial killer, your story is only halfway there. The best stories also incorporate strong internal conflict. Most stories already have external conflict because they're what we think about first when we're creating a plot. This type of conflict involves any outside forces that are out of your protagonist's control, like an unlivable environment or weather event, or an enemy, or that creepy old neighbor who keeps yodeling in the middle of the night. These are all external conflicts, and you can tell because you can usually talk about external conflicts with the protagonist versus obstacle formula. For example, in Jurassic Park, the external conflict is humans versus dinosaurs. On the flip side, internal conflict refers to what your protagonist is battling inside their own mind. Their most painful memories, their biggest regrets, or their deepest fears. It's the protagonist versus themselves. And navigating their internal conflict is what transforms your protagonist over the course of the story. Internal conflict ensures the plot is not only exciting on an action level, but also emotionally impactful, because we're able to witness how the story's events change the protagonist. Internal conflict makes the story feel deep, nuanced, and emotionally moving. If you haven't developed your story's internal conflict yet, here are some questions to use to figure out what your protagonist is grappling with. What are their biggest regrets? What keeps them up at night? What are their deepest insecurities? What do they fear above all else? Make sure the reader knows these things about your protagonist and that we see them grappling with their internal conflict on the page via their interiority. I promise it's going to make us feel so much more emotionally connected to them and invested in their journey. In short, external conflict provides the plot, internal conflict provides the emotion, and you need both. Let's talk about an example of a plot that relies almost entirely on external conflict. Jurassic Park. Don't get me wrong, I love this movie. It's a classic for a reason. But when you drill into the conflict, it's nearly 100% about humans versus dinosaurs. Yes, Dr. Grant does question the ethics of the park, but his internal conflict takes a backseat to the pure need to survive. The tension doesn't really revolve around his internal reckoning. It's all about escaping the T-Rex's deadly grasp. That doesn't make it a bad novel or a film, of course, but developing the internal conflict could make it even more layered and impactful. Now let's look at an example that nails both the external and internal conflict, The Arrival. The external conflict is the first contact with aliens, where the protagonist Luis, who's a linguist, must help decipher the aliens' language to keep the world from falling into chaos. Super compelling, right? But we also get a lot of Luis's internal conflict as she grapples with the discovery that she will have a daughter that she will lose to terminal illness. We witness her grieving an unbearable loss she hasn't even experienced yet, and reckoning with the choice to even have the child that she knows she will lose too soon. Because both the external and internal conflicts are strong, The Arrival's plot operates on multiple levels. There's a fast-paced, urgent, action-packed plot, and a thought-provoking character study. Once you have your external and internal conflicts figured out, the next step is to ensure they emerge in the story organically, because the next quality of good conflict is that it's believable. Imagine this. You're writing a contemporary romance novel set in a small town in New England. You have a steamy romance between the sexy bookstore owner and the traveling nurse who's in town temporarily. And just as their relationship heats up, they're torn apart by a tornado that rips through their neighborhood and destroys their homes. Unless this is a speculative world where tornadoes are common in New England, in which case you would want to establish that early in the novel, This development is likely going to throw your reader off and feel totally out of the blue. But even if this was a more plausible weather event, like a hurricane, you still want to make sure it doesn't feel random. If your conflict comes out of nowhere, readers are going to check out and lose trust in your storytelling. The conflict should feel plausible, something the plot has been building to over time. Here's a moment from Twilight that always struck me as a bit implausible and contrived: the baseball showdown scene. You know the one I'm talking about. It's such a striking, pun intended, and honestly super goofy scene. And part of why it's so memorable is because it comes out of left field. Another pun intended. Up to this point, the conflict has revolved around Bella and Edward. So the sudden appearance of these other vampires and James's fixation on Bella feel like random developments thrown in for no other reason than to amplify the conflict. Also, do you know any families who have a baseball game tradition complete with custom branded hats? Maybe it's normal. I admittedly don't come from a sporty family. I much prefer the natural conflict building in the Queen's Gambit. Beth's rise through the chess world naturally builds up to her ultimate battle, a match against the best player on the planet. And her success in this match requires her to face her internal conflict of her addiction, making this scene so emotionally satisfying. Conflict should never feel like a random twist thrown in to spice things up. It should always be rooted in who your characters are, the environment they're in, and the choices they've made. Once you set up your conflict properly and make it believable, the final key to writing good conflict is realizing that good conflict is difficult to resolve. If the solution to the conflict is just handed to your characters, if the T-Rex suddenly collapses and dies, or the vampires decide to move across the country and never come after Bella again, your reader will wonder, what did I just read all of that for? We want to see the characters have to work to resolve their conflict, and that tension should keep us going into the final pages of the book. Imagine if the final battle of Avengers Endgame happened in the middle of the movie instead. Why would we keep watching? If you resolve conflict too soon, you won't retain your reader's interest. So make sure there's something unresolved and uncomfortable pulling us to the final page. Here's an example where the conflict fizzles out prematurely, so the plot feels thin. 50 Shades of Grey. The initial conflict, Anna navigating her feelings for Christian and his whole thing, gets dealt with pretty quickly. After a few awkward conversations, they're together. And once they're together, there's no more tension. What are we left with for the rest of the story? We mostly see them fight about his control issues, then come to some kind of lukewarm resolution and make up in graphic, sexy scenes. Then they fight about the same thing again, and then we get more sexy scenes. Because the conflict keeps resolving, then restarting in the same way over and over, it feels like the story spins in place. Your conflict should ideally escalate leading up to the climax. This technique is what keeps your readers and your characters on edge until the very final pages. So now let's talk about conflict done right. Look at Gone Girl. The story's central conflict between Nick and Amy never lets up. Just when you think you understand their dynamic, it shifts entirely. First, it's, did Nick kill Amy? Then it's, oh no, she's framing him. Then it's, wait, now she's in danger. Then it's, oh crap, now she's back. Every time the conflict resolves, it actually transforms into a twisted version of itself. That's what keeps us reading. Conflict is your plot's engine, so you must keep giving it fuel. If you stop feeding it, your story will putter out and die. This is why stories often have a saggy middle problem. The conflict either resolves prematurely or doesn't evolve or escalate. Let's tie it all together. If you want your conflict to work, you need external and internal conflict, believability, and sustained tension. But guess what? Everything I just said is useless unless you understand how to craft strong character objectives that create conflict in the first place. So watch this video to learn how to craft strong objectives and avoid the most common mistakes writers make with their protagonist. Once your objectives are in place, your conflict will write itself. Thanks so much for watching, and happy writing.